I'm going to walk you through the entire process of capturing the most incredible, most cinematic footage with the DJI Osmo Pocket 4P. And I'm specifically going to be focusing on using D-LOG2 and getting those 17 stops of dynamic range that DJI touts on this incredible camera. It's not difficult to do, but if you don't have the right settings, you're either going to miss out on getting those full 17 stops and maximizing that dynamic range, or you're going to potentially end up with unusable footage. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna plug in those core settings. So first of all, make sure you're in 4K 24 or 4K 30. Either of those frame rates is going to work. Second, we're gonna swipe over left from the right, and we're gonna set our detailed image parameters here. So first of all, for the exposure, you do not want auto exposure. You wanna change this to M for manual. And then if you're filming in 24 frames per second, you wanna set this to 1/50 for your shutter speed. And then for your ISO, you wanna set your ISO to 800. Why 800 for the ISO? So D-LOG2 theoretically has a base ISO that starts at 100, but it runs all the way up to 3200. But we're looking for the ISO that gives us a balance of the maximum dynamic range without having too much extra noise in the footage. And based on my experimenting with the 4P, I have found that ideal ISO with D-LOG2 is ISO 800. But there is a trade-off worth knowing. The white clipping point does shift with the ISO. So if you were to use ISO 100 on here, the highlights will clip at around 70 IRE. But as you raise the ISO, that point climbs. And basically the ISO where the highlights are going to clip at the highest level is technically going to be ISO 1600. However, what I have found with 1600 is I have found that this adds a little bit extra noise to the footage, and we are trying to prevent noise in the shadows with this ISO. Because basically what we're doing is we are shining a light into the shadows, and we are going to be exposing to the right. Now, if you don't know what exposing to the right means, I'm going to explain that in a moment because I'm going to show you some demonstrations. But at ISO 1600, the IRE reaches 94, but at ISO 800, it appears to be about 89. So by going from ISO 1600 down to ISO 800, you're only losing about 5 on that highlight clipping. And an 89 IRE is really good for the highlights. You're going to see in a moment that you really don't have to worry about clipping those, even when overexposing by quite a bit. And do note that if you're using the 3X lens, you cannot use that with D-LOG2. So if you're using the 3X Med Tele, you're going to have to use D-Log. And I'm going to show you D-Log in a moment as well, so that you know how to perfectly expose both of those. So the next thing we're gonna have to do on here is we're gonna need some ND filters. As you can see here, this is pretty massively overexposed right now, even more to the right than we want for our exposure. So what I've got here to save the day is I've got ND filters from Freewell. And this particular pack is the Bright Day pack. And basically this has both the ND filter effect and the polarizer on there. So this is really good, this pack right here, for minimizing light pollution, and absolutely love these filters. I've used them a lot with the 4P already, and they've not let me down. So I wanna show you how to put these ND filters on. So the first thing we wanna do is we wanna power off the camera, because we don't wanna be fighting against the gimbal head when we're trying to put ND filters on. And the next thing we wanna do is we wanna remove the default lens protector here. So all you have to do is just twist down to the left slightly, and it's gonna come off right there. And then when putting a filter on, you're just gonna do the opposite. So you're gonna go in here, you're gonna look at your filters, and you're gonna pick one. So I'm actually going to start with ND8. So I've got ND8 right here. There's gonna be these that are gonna align with some grooves on here. You wanna make sure the big filter lines up with the 1-inch lens and the little one with the 3X. So I'm gonna put these on just like that, and we're gonna twist up and to the right. And everything's gonna click into place there. And by the way, if you wanna maximize the polarizing effect, you just wanna make sure these two lines in the filter, the one on the dial you can turn and the one here, line up. So now that we've got our ND filters on, we're gonna turn the Pocket 4P back on. So let me finish showing you these settings here before I demonstrate which exposure value you want to use. For the white balance, if it's during the daytime, set a manual static value, set it to 5600K. It's gonna make grading and color grading that footage much, much easier later on. And of course, make sure the tint is set at 0. And then down here, make sure your color mode is D-LOG2. And then for focus breathing compensation, make sure that's turned on, focus mode continuous, and then make sure texture and noise reduction are both set to -2. And when you click into D-LOG2 10-bit with the color recovery here, I actually recommend turning it off. Now, of course, the footage is not going to look like this after we grade it. But if you use the color recovery on here, or if you use your phone for the preview, it's not going to necessarily represent the exposure accurately. And that's really what we're going for here. So ND8 is actually not strong enough because I want this to be down under the 3V. I actually want to get this down to 0.0 EV first, because I want to show you what that default balanced exposure would look like with this mode. All right, it's time to bring out the big guy. It's time to get ND64 on there. ND64 is on now. So this is what 0.0 EV looks like. So I'm going to show you this both ungraded and graded, so you can see what it looks like. And I'm actually going to zoom in on each of these clips also, so you can see how the shadows look. So in this scene, there are of course bright highlights behind me, but my shirt, I purposely wore a black shirt to have lots of shadows there. And I want to show you what the noise looks like in the shadows at 0.0 EV. There's also going to be a little bit of noise over this way as well, because this is shadows here too. So this is what 0.0 EV looks like. So this is what +1 EV looks like. So we're technically overexposed for this whole scene by +1 right now. Everything is going to look brighter when ungraded, but as you can see, even with that little bit of overexposure, this footage still grades really nicely. So zooming in on the shadows here, the shadows have less noise than they did with the 0.0, but there's still a good bit of noise there. And the highlights, they're still preserved. The sky is pretty milky right now in color, but there are still plenty of cloud details up there that you can see. So next, we're going to do EV +2. So let's pop on our ND16 filter, turn it back on. So this is +2 EV. This is where you should really start to notice these shadows looking a lot nicer with a lot less noise. But at the same time, even at +2 EV, there should still be recoverable details in the highlights. The highlights should not be completely blown out, not yet. So we're gonna turn this back off, and we're going to try ND8 first, because the EV on here only goes up to +3 that it actually shows. So if we get beyond +3, we're not gonna know how far beyond it is, and we don't want that. We wanna be precise here so that you fully understand this. So this is ND8, and ND8 takes us right there to +3 EV. So this is what +3 EV looks like. So the shadows should look really good now, but with the highlights, we're going to start to see clipping. So this is where a decision needs to be made. Depending on the specific scene that you're filming, if the shadows mean more to you than the highlights, and you don't mind having a little bit of blown out highlights, which there are plenty of scenes where that is perfectly acceptable, especially if you want to have a subject exposed properly and you don't care about the highlights and your subject's in the shadow, then +3 EV can be an acceptable option in those cases. But if it's really important to you to have some of that highlight detail preserved, then I recommend doing +2 EV. I have found that for general use, if you're in and out of shadows and highlights and you want the best of both worlds for both, then aim for an EV value of approximately +2. But if you happen to get to +3, don't worry too much about it, because you're still going to be able to recover pretty much everything in that except the brightest of highlights. Those you're going to have slightly overblown with +3. But as you can see, even with +3, this footage from ungraded to graded grades really nicely, and there's so much detail available to bring out from that D-LOG2. The Pocket 4P does an incredible job preserving those details in D-LOG2. Before I show you how to correct this footage in post-production, I need to show you how to expose D-Log in that 3x Med-Tele mode as well. So D-Log is a little bit easier. There's not quite as much room to work with when exposing to the right. There's only one setting you're going to change initially, and that is the ISO. The base ISO for D-Log is 400. Let's get that ISO changed right here. We're gonna put it to 400. And I will say with my testing, between +1 and +2 EV is the sweet spot with D-Log. Now it's really going to depend on which type of environment you're shooting in. So if your environment has more shadows and less highlights, I would go with EV +2. But if it's a bright sunny day and you're not really in a lot of shadows, I would go with EV +1. But if you're anywhere between those two, you're still going to have wonderful looking shadows in midtones. And if you're toward the upper end and it's really bright, you might lose a little bit of detail in the highlights. But if I had to give a single recommendation for D-Log, it would be exposed for about +1.6. 1.6 isn't always going to be possible precisely on here, but anytime you're hanging out around that +1.6, that's going to be the real sweet spot for D-Log. So now I'm going to show you how to grade and correct D-Log2 and D-Log footage. So I've got a couple clips here, and all of these are D-Log2 exposed at +2. In addition, I have a D-Log clip where I'm using the 3x Med-Tele lens, and this one is +1.6. So the first thing we want to do with the D-Log2 clips, and by the way, I'm showing you this in Premiere Pro, but the steps I'm going to show you will apply nicely to pretty much any other video editing software that allows you to grade footage. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go down to Creative, and we are going to add our conversion LUT. I've got all of these looks that I've created in a folder here, but I'm going to start with the LUT from DJI, so it's going to be this one right here, the D-Log2 to Rec 709 conversion LUT. And we want to add that under Creative in Premiere Pro. We don't want to add it under Basic, because under Basic, we have some of the key exposure settings, and we want these to be above the LUT. So when I first add that, you can see on the waveform over here that things are way blown out, because yes, we filmed it at +2.0. So after we add the conversion LUT, the first thing we want to do on our basic correction is we want to drag the exposure down. And I am going to drag it down to about -1.5. So after we've brought the exposure down, you can see everything is between about 5 at the low end, where the shadows are, which would represent over here in my shirt, and then about 80 up here on the upper end. So first thing we can do is we can add back some highlights, and I'm going to add those back till we get to about 90. So that's going to add some nice contrast there, and I like how that looks. But then shadows, we're going to add a little bit of darkness to the shadows. And the nice thing is when we film with it overexposed by +2, we don't have that noise baked into the shadows. So if we had to bring up the shadows a little further, there wouldn't be much noise there. But most of the time when you're filming at +2, you're only going to need to bring down the shadows just a little bit to get the exposure you want. So I'm going to bring those down slightly there. Don't want to make it too dark. I like it right there. And then if we look over here, we're still above 0. Nothing is below 0 in clipping. You also can play with the blacks a little bit here. So you can add some black back, but if you do that, be very careful. Watch your screen over there, because when I add that, that does get us down hitting that 0 line. So I'm going to add just a little bit there. So that was our starting point before adding some black, and that was our ending point. So after I add that little bit of black, I'm going to pull down the shadows just slightly. So then we're going to take a look at this. Make sure everything looks good there. It does. There's only one thing that's off slightly, and that is my white balance. So to keep it simple, I'm going to click on the only thing that is fully white in my scene. Believe it or not, the sky is not white. There are some cloud details up there. It was a lot of those high canopy of cirrus clouds, so that is how the sky looked. But I'm going to click on one of the letters of my DJI mic down here. And as you can see, it brings it up a little bit on the yellows and a little bit on the pink. This was filmed in the evening when we were getting towards sunset, so that makes sense. The color temperature would be a little bit warmer. So if you want to see where we started with this clip, I'm going to turn this off right here. That was our starting point, and that is our graded point. Much better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next clip where it was a lot brighter. There's a lot less shadows in this clip. This was in very bright sunlight along a hike. But it was a very cool textured rock shale layers here that were tilted up on their side. So as you can see, our starting point here, everything is very, very flat with D-LOG2. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to go to Creative, and I'm going to add our D-LOG2 to Rec 709 LUT. And things are quite bright when I add that. Now technically nothing is overexposed over here, nothing's above 100, nothing's below 0. But we do want to bring down the exposure a little bit for our starting point. Because you can see when we do that, we get back quite a bit of detail. So in this case, I'm going to bring it down by about negative 1.5. And then I'm going to selectively add back the highlights. So we're going to get some stretch there. I like it about right there. And then I'm going to pull down the shadows to add some more contrast. And then we're going to pull down on the blacks a little bit. Just making sure nothing goes below 0 there. So I like that. I like how that looks. But I am still going to add a little bit more highlight. And you can play around with this. Like in this scene, I thought the exposure maybe needed to come down 1.5, but it probably doesn't need to come down that far. Probably about 1 is good on there. But if we want to come down on the whites a little, because there is a lot of white reflectivity in here, we can drag that down a little bit. And yeah, I like how that looks right there. But in this particular scene, I do want to add some vibrance to it. Everything is just kind of very dull. So we can go down here to Creative and we can drag the vibrance over. So I'm going to drag it to right about 50. That gives us a good bit of greens and it gives us some of those brown colors that were in those rocks. Now this was filmed in the middle of the day with the sun hitting down on those. And that's honestly not the best lighting. You're not going to get as good of looking footage in the middle of the day. It's not that it's going to look bad, it's just the nature of filming in the middle of the day. So just drag through our clip here, make sure everything looks good. And this was our starting point, and this was our graded point. So I like how that looks, but I feel like this clip could benefit from an additional look to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset completely everything that we did. I'm going to go to Creative, and I'm going to add a look. And for this one, I'm going to try adding the Deep Cinema first. So I've added that. I like how that looks. It gives it kind of more of a Old West feel. So I like how that looks. That's before, that's after. And by the way, my looks have the complete conversion LUT and all of the exposure correction, everything like that built into them. So after you apply it to your footage, you may still need to do some fine tuning with the exposure. Like you may be able to go up here and add a little bit more in the highlights or pull down a little bit in the shadows. So by no means are those a finish point, but they're going to get you 90% of the way there. So if you don't want to do all of this manually, you can add those LUTs and looks and then you can fine tune it depending on your particular scene. So this one, I think it benefits from a little more shadows and then a little bit more highlight stretch and then a little bit more black there. So yeah, that looks great. And then I want to go forward to this clip right here. This was another one I filmed with D-LOG2 and exposed to the right by +2. So for this one, instead of showing you the raw grading process again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a look right away. So for this one, I kind of want to add a warm look. It was a warm, hot, sunny day. I want to give that little bit of tropical look to it. I like how that looks right out of the gate there. That looks really good. As you can see over here, we do have a lot more highlight we could work with. So if you wanted to bring up the highlights to make it brighter, you could. We can drag this way up and we're not overexposing. But to add more contrast, I would want to add a little bit more shadow darkness there and a little bit of black as well. So this is our starting point, that's our finished grade point. So if we didn't want that LUT or look and we wanted to remove that and add a different one, the other one that I think would look good in this scene is that classic cinematic look. So I'm gonna add that right here. I really like how that looks. That looks quite cool. As with the other one, if we want to add a little bit of highlights here, we can do that. We're definitely not clipping over the 100, but D-LOG2 is incredible. There is so much data available in that D-LOG2, that log profile, that you can bring out. You can customize all that data for pretty much any look that you're going for. And then finally, let's take a look at this D-Log clip. So for grading D-Log, you don't have quite as much flexibility as D-Log2. That's why I do like D-Log2 the most, but if you're using the 3x Med Tele, D-Log2 is of course not an option. So what we're first gonna do is we're gonna add our D-Log to Rec 709 LUT, and you wanna make sure it's D-Log. You don't wanna add the D-Log2 LUT, because that isn't gonna work out for you. And after we've applied that, I did overexpose by about plus 1.6, but a lot of this is in the shadows. We're not really at that full exposure till the end of the clip. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit, but I'm gonna bring it down to about negative 0.5. And then I'm gonna give the highlights quite a bit of stretch here. And then the shadows are so clean here, but I'm just gonna add a little bit of darkness back for contrast and a tiny bit of black. I'm gonna pull that down there to about -5. And then the whites were good. There's already plenty of white in the water there, but I'm gonna bring the highlights up just a little bit more. And then I am gonna add a little bit of vibrance here. I'm gonna do plus 40. I like how that looks. That looks incredible. And then I'm just gonna make sure my white balance is good. So I'm gonna click the water right here, and that corrected it slightly there. The skin tones on my sun here, those look really good. I like how those look. So let's look through this clip. And I love that 3x Med Tele, that 60mm perspective. It really gives a nice feel and look to clips that are filmed with that. Going back here, this was our starting point. This was our ending point. Looks incredible. So I'm also gonna clear this though and just show you that I do have a conversion LUT for this too. I did not make any looks for the D-Log. I only did for the D-Log2, but if you want any special ones, let me know, and I will see if I can get some of those cooked up for you. But I do have one here that you can apply to that plus 1.6 footage that's gonna have the exposure adjustment and the highlight and shadow adjustment as well. So if you apply that, it's gonna be your starting point right there. And then that is yours to fine tune as you need to, but that is a good starting point if you don't wanna do it from scratch like I just showed you. So now that we've graded all those clips, I just wanna show you really quick the export settings that I recommend. You can do a great job grading footage, get beautiful clips, but if you don't export them with the right settings, there's going to be that blockiness and low quality potentially in there, and you don't want that. You don't wanna ruin what you've created. So what you first wanna do is you wanna select Match Source Adaptive High Bitrate. And then down here under Video, you wanna click Match Source again. You wanna make sure you select Render at Maximum Depth and use Maximum Render Quality. And then down here, you wanna go to Profile High, and you may have to uncheck it here. And then here, you wanna go to Level 5.2. And then finally, you don't have to change anything else except down here under bitrate encoding, you wanna go to CBR. CBR stands for constant bitrate. And if you want the very best footage, I recommend setting this to a bitrate of 100. Now 100 is going to give you a larger file size, but it's going to look really good when you upload it to YouTube or other social media platforms. But if you are tight on storage space, then drop this down to about 65, and it's still going to look pretty good. There's going to potentially be some compression artifacts in there. It's not going to look quite as good as 100, but when you upload it to YouTube, the difference is not going to be super noticeable. So once you've keyed in your bitrate, you're then going to click Export right here, and your footage is going to export. And if you'd like to learn more about how to get the very best footage with the DJI Osmo Pocket 4P, check out this playlist right here.